The deafening crack of splintering wood and panicked screams shattered the peaceful desert air as the stagecoach careened off the narrow mountain pass. Elizabeth Stewart clung desperately to the leather strap beside her window, her knuckles white with strain as the world outside became a dizzying blur of dust and sky. Then came the impact, violent and absolute, sending her consciousness spiraling into darkness. The Arizona Territory, 1878, was unforgiving to those who traveled its rugged expanses, and Elizabeth had known the risks. A schoolteacher from Boston, she had accepted a position in the growing frontier town of Redemption Creek, seeking a new beginning after the passing of her parents. The stagecoach had been making good time until the bandits appeared on the ridge. Pain was the first sensation that returned to her, a searing, white-hot agony in her left leg. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open to a nightmare of twisted metal, shattered wood, and terrible stillness. Dust particles danced in the rays of sunlight that pierced the wreckage. She tried to move, but found herself pinned beneath what remained of the coach's roof. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "Is anyone there?" No response came from the driver or the other passengers, a traveling salesman and an elderly woman heading to visit her son. Elizabeth's throat constricted with fear as she realized what their silence likely meant. Tears welled in her eyes as shock gave way to the terrible reality of her situation. Miles from civilization, trapped in a deadly prison of wood and metal, with the merciless sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky, hours passed. The heat became unbearable as midday approached. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, her parched lips cracking as dehydration set in. In her more lucid moments, she thought of the life she'd never have, the children she'd never teach in Redemption Creek, and the dreams that would die with her in this forsaken place. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats that finally penetrated her delirium. At first she thought it was her mind playing cruel tricks, but when a shadow fell across her face blocking the punishing sun, she forced her eyes open. "Sweet mercy," a deep voice murmured. "Miss, can you hear me?" Elizabeth tried to respond, but her throat was too dry. She managed a weak nod. "Hold on. I'm going to get you out of there." The figure moved out of her line of vision, and Elizabeth heard the sound of boots on gravel, then the creak of strained wood as someone began to pull away pieces of the wreckage. Minutes later, hands gentle but strong were checking her for injuries. "My leg," she managed to rasp. "I think it's broken. Don't you worry about that now. First things first, let's get you some water." A canteen was pressed to her lips, and Elizabeth drank greedily, the cool liquid like heaven against her parched throat. As her rescuer continued to carefully remove the debris pinning her, Elizabeth got her first good look at him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A dusty cowboy hat sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was angular but handsome, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "Thomas Morgan," he said, noticing her gaze. "Most folks call me Tucker." "Elizabeth Stewart," she replied, her voice stronger now. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Morgan." Tucker's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Let's get you free before you start handing out medals, Miss Stewart." With careful precision, he lifted the final beam trapping her leg, grimacing at the sight of her injury. The bone wasn't protruding, but her calf was bent at an unnatural angle. "I need to set this before we move you," he said grimly. "It's going to hurt something fierce." Elizabeth nodded, steeling herself. "Do what you must." Tucker removed his bandana and offered it to her. "Bite down on this." She placed the fabric between her teeth, just as his strong hands took hold of her leg. The pain that followed was blinding, electric in its intensity. A muffled scream escaped her before darkness claimed her once more. When Elizabeth awoke again, She was moving. Strong arms held her against a warm chest as a horse carried them at a steady pace across the open terrain. Night had fallen, and the desert air had cooled considerably. "Welcome back," Tucker said, his voice rumbling against her ear where it pressed to his chest. "The others?" Elizabeth asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. A heavy silence followed. "I buried them proper," he finally replied. "Said words over them, too. I'm sorry, Miss Stewart." Grief washed over her for the strangers who had shared her journey. "Thank you for that kindness," she whispered. "My cabin's about an hour's ride from here," Tucker told her. "It ain't much, but it's clean and safe. I can tend to your leg proper there, then take you to town when you're ready to travel." Elizabeth wanted to protest, to insist she could make it to Redemption Creek immediately, but exhaustion and pain made the decision for her. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Morgan." "Tucker," he corrected. "Mr. Morgan was my father, and he was a mean old cuss not worthy of the title." Despite everything, Elizabeth found herself smiling slightly. "Tucker, then." They rode in companionable silence, the rhythm of the horse's gait and Tucker's steady heartbeat lulling Elizabeth into a state between wakefulness and sleep. The stars above blazed in their thousands, more than she'd ever seen in Boston's light-polluted skies. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Tucker asked, following her gaze upward. "That's one thing I never tire of out here. Makes a man feel small, but in a good way." "In Boston, you can barely see the stars at all," Elizabeth replied. "Too many gas lamps and too much smoke. Boston, that's a fair piece from here. What brings a city lady like yourself to this God-forsaken territory? I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Redemption Creek," she explained. "Or I was supposed to be. I imagine they'll have found someone else by now." Tucker shook his head. "I doubt it. Redemption Creek's been trying to get a proper teacher for over a year. Folks there will wait for you, especially once they hear what happened." Elizabeth wasn't so certain, but she was too tired to argue the point. True to Tucker's word, they arrived at a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping about an hour later. It was simple but solidly built, with a corral for horses and a small garden plot to one side. A creek gurgled nearby, providing the precious water that made life possible in this harsh landscape. Tucker dismounted with Elizabeth still in his arms, carrying her as if she weighed nothing at all. Inside, the cabin was spare but neat, a far cry from what Elizabeth had expected of a bachelor's dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a bed, table with 2 chairs, and a small bookshelf constituted the majority of the furnishings. "You read?" Elizabeth couldn't help asking as Tucker gently laid her on the bed. A slight flush colored his cheeks. "When I can. Books are hard to come by out here, but I trade for them when possible." He busied himself lighting a lamp and stoking the banked fire while Elizabeth took stock of her situation. Her dress was torn and filthy, her leg throbbed painfully despite Tucker's skilled splinting, and all her worldly possessions, pitifully few to begin with, were lost in the stagecoach wreck. Yet she was alive, which was more than could be said for her fellow passengers. "I need to clean that leg properly and make a better splint," Tucker said, interrupting her thoughts. "I've got some whiskey that'll help with the pain." Elizabeth had never touched spirits in her life, but she nodded gratefully as he poured a generous measure into a tin cup. "Drink it all down," he instructed. "Quick is best." She followed his advice, gasping as the liquid burned its way down her throat and settled like fire in her belly. Tucker's mouth quirked in amusement at her reaction. "Never had whiskey before. Is it that obvious?" she managed between coughs. "Just a bit." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, she noticed. It transformed his weathered face, making him look younger and more approachable. The whiskey did its work quickly, dulling Elizabeth's senses as Tucker carefully cut away the fabric of her dress around the injury. She should have been mortified at the impropriety, but survival had a way of reshaping one's priorities. "I was a field medic during the war," Tucker explained as he worked. "Seen worse than this, though not by much. You're lucky the break is clean." "Were you with the Union forces?" Elizabeth asked, partly from curiosity and partly to distract herself from what he was doing. Tucker nodded. "Cavalry. Enlisted in '62, fought till Appomattox." His hands stilled momentarily. "Lost a lot of good men, came west afterward, couldn't stomach going back home to Tennessee." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. Tucker resumed his work, his touch gentle despite his calloused hands. "War changes a man, makes him see things different. Out here, a person can breathe, make their own way without the weight of the past bearing down." Elizabeth understood that sentiment all too well. After losing both parents to influenza within weeks of each other, Boston had become suffocating with memories and sympathetic glances. The teaching position in Arizona Territory had offered escape as much as opportunity. When Tucker finished with the splint, he helped Elizabeth into one of his own shirts, turning his back politely while she changed. The garment swallowed her slender frame, but it was clean and smelled of sunlight and sage. "You should rest now," he told her. "I'll take the floor." Elizabeth started to protest, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. The next few days passed in a hazy routine. Tucker tended to her injury, brought her food and water, and spent hours simply talking with her. Elizabeth learned he'd been a rancher of sorts for 5 years, running a small herd of cattle on land he'd claimed through the Homestead Act. He lived simply, but wasn't poor, selling his beeves to the army and to growing frontier towns like Redemption Creek. In turn, she told him about Boston, her teaching, and her dreams of making a difference in the lives of frontier children. Tucker listened intently, asking questions that revealed a sharp intelligence behind his unassuming manner. "Most folks out here had schooling cut short by necessity," he said one evening as they shared a meal of rabbit stew. "Including me. Made it through 8th grade before I had to help full-time on my family's farm." "You speak very well for someone with limited formal education," Elizabeth observed. Tucker looked almost embarrassed. "My mother was particular about proper speech, and I read when I can, like I said." On the 4th day, Elizabeth insisted on getting up. "I can't lie abed forever," she declared, "and you can't keep sleeping on the floor." Tucker had fashioned a crude crutch from a forked branch, which allowed her to move around the small cabin with some independence. It was a small victory, but it lifted her spirits immeasurably. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Elizabeth broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I need to get to Redemption Creek soon," she said. "They're expecting me, and I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Tucker's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "Your leg needs more time to heal. The journey would be hard even for someone hale and hearty." "I have responsibilities," Elizabeth insisted, "and I can't stay here indefinitely. It's not proper." A silence stretched between them, filled with the evening sounds of the desert, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through scrub brush. "I could marry you," Tucker said suddenly, then immediately looked mortified at his own words. "I mean that as it would make it proper. You're staying here while you heal." Elizabeth stared at him, speechless. "That came out all wrong," Tucker groaned, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair. "I'm not suggesting I wouldn't presume." He took a deep breath. "What I meant was, I respect you, Miss Stewart. I wouldn't want your reputation sullied because circumstances forced you to accept my help." Despite everything, Elizabeth found herself laughing a genuine, heartfelt sound that surprised them both. "Mr. Morgan, that may be the most backward proposal a woman has ever received." Tucker's cheeks flushed deep red, visible even in the dimming light. It wasn't a proposal, just a practical consideration. Elizabeth's laughter subsided, but her smile remained. I appreciate the thought, misguided as it was, but I think we can find a more conventional solution. Relief and something that might have been disappointment crossed Tucker's face. Of course, I didn't mean to offend. You didn't, she assured him, surprised to find it was true. In fact, there was something endearing about his awkward attempt to protect her reputation. It spoke to a fundamental decency that Elizabeth found increasingly rare. The next morning, a visitor arrived, the first since Elizabeth had been staying with Tucker. The sound of approaching hoofbeats brought Tucker to the door, rifle in hand, until he recognized the rider. "Illy, wasn't expecting you for another week," he called out as a weather-beaten man in his 50s dismounted. "Got the supplies you asked for," the man replied, then stopped short when he spotted Elizabeth standing in the doorway, leaning on her crutch. "Well now, what's this?" Tucker quickly explained the situation while the man, Illy Perkins, a trader who traveled between the scattered settlements, eyed Elizabeth with open curiosity. "Headed for Redemption Creek, were you?" Illy asked when Tucker finished. "As it happens, I'm heading that way myself day after tomorrow. Could take word to the town council about what happened, let them know you're alive but recovering." Elizabeth seized the opportunity. "Would you? I'd be so grateful. They're expecting a teacher, and I'd hate for them to think I've abandoned the position." Illy agreed readily, and after sharing a meal with them, continued on his way with a letter from Elizabeth to the town council explaining her situation. "That was fortuitous," Elizabeth remarked as they watched Illy ride away. Tucker nodded, though something in his expression had changed. "Illy's a good man. He'll make sure they get your letter." That evening, a strange tension hung in the air. Tucker was quieter than usual, responding to Elizabeth's attempts at conversation with one-word answers or distracted nods. Finally, she confronted him. "Have I done something to upset you?" Tucker looked startled. "No, of course not." "Then why are you suddenly acting as though I've become a burden to you?" He sighed heavily, setting aside the harness he'd been mending. "It's not that, Miss Stewart." "Elizabeth," she corrected him. After all they'd been through, formality seemed absurd. "Elizabeth," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. "I suppose I'm just realizing that soon you'll be gone and things will go back to how they were before." The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Elizabeth found herself at a loss for words. In the short time she'd known Tucker Morgan, he had saved her life, tended her injuries, and shown her a kindness and respect that asked nothing in return. Somewhere along the way, he had also begun to occupy a space in her heart she hadn't known existed. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "things don't have to be exactly as they were before." Tucker's gaze met hers, a cautious hope dawning in his gray eyes. "What are you saying, Elizabeth?" "I'm saying that Redemption Creek is only 15 miles from your land. That's not so very far, is it?" A slow smile spread across Tucker's face, transforming it just as it had that first night. "Not far at all, especially for a man with a good horse." The understanding between them shifted, deepened. Nothing more needed to be said that night, but Elizabeth fell asleep with a lighter heart than she'd had in years. 2 weeks later, Illy Perkins returned, this time accompanied by a delegation from Redemption Creek, the mayor, the town doctor, and a matronly woman introduced as Mrs. Hollister, who owned the boarding house where Elizabeth was to stay. The doctor examined Elizabeth's leg and declared Tucker had done a damn fine job, begging your pardon, madam, with the setting. Her bone was healing well, though she would need to continue using the crutch for several more weeks. "The school term doesn't start for another month," the mayor informed her. "Plenty of time for you to finish healing. We've got a room ready at Mrs. Hollister's whenever you're fit to travel." Mrs. Hollister, a widow with sharp eyes but a kind smile, pulled Elizabeth aside while the men talked. "That cowboy of yours seems a decent sort," she observed. "Known him to trade in town for years. Quiet type but respected." Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm. "He's not my cowboy, Mrs. Hollister." The older woman's knowing look said she wasn't fooled. "If you say so, dear." But a woman alone in these parts would do well to consider a man like that. Not many gentlemen to be found in the territory. The Redemption Creek delegation stayed only long enough to rest their horses before heading back, leaving Elizabeth with the promise they'd return in 2 weeks to escort her to town if she felt ready to travel by then. After they departed, Tucker found Elizabeth sitting outside, watching the sunset in what had become their evening ritual. "Seems you made quite an impression," he remarked, settling beside her. "The mayor couldn't stop singing your praises, and he barely knows you." Elizabeth smiled. "I suspect they're simply desperate for a teacher. Or maybe they recognized quality when they saw it," Tucker countered. He hesitated, then added, "2 weeks isn't very long." "No," Elizabeth agreed softly. "It isn't." The days that followed took on a bittersweet quality. Elizabeth's strength returned rapidly, and she began helping around the cabin, cooking meals, mending clothes, and even attempting to expand Tucker's small garden with seeds she'd found in his supplies. Tucker, for his part, seemed determined to show her every beautiful vista within riding distance of his property. He fashioned a special stirrup that allowed her to ride despite her splinted leg, and together they explored hidden canyons, crystal-clear springs, and ancient petroglyphs carved into rock faces by peoples long vanished. On one such excursion, they stopped to rest by a small waterfall that fed into a clear pool. The desert was in bloom after recent rains, wildflowers adding splashes of color to the typically monochrome landscape. "I never imagined the desert could be so beautiful," Elizabeth admitted as Tucker helped her down from her horse. "Most people only see what they expect to see," Tucker replied. "They think desert means emptiness, but it's full of life if you know where to look." Elizabeth studied him as he unsaddled the horses, noting how at ease he was in this harsh environment. There was a quiet confidence to him that she found increasingly attractive. This man had saved her from certain death, nursed her back to health, and asked for nothing in return. In Boston, men had courted her with flowers and pretty words, but none had shown the depth of character Tucker Morgan possessed. "Tucker," she said suddenly, "do you remember that night you jokingly suggested marriage?" He froze in the act of filling their canteens from the spring. "I recall it wasn't my finest moment," he said cautiously. Elizabeth gathered her courage. "What if it wasn't so outlandish an idea?" Tucker turned to face her, water forgotten. "Elizabeth, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that in 2 days I'll be leaving for Redemption Creek. I'll teach children, board with Mrs. Hollister, and build a life there." She took a deep breath. "But I find myself wondering if there might be room in that life for more." Tucker crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Are you asking me to court you properly, Elizabeth Stewart?" "I believe I am," she replied, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. Tucker's weathered hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then I accept, though I warn you I'm not much good at fancy courting rituals." "I don't need fancy," Elizabeth whispered. "I just need honest." When his lips met hers, it was like coming home to a place she'd never been before. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as they both surrendered to feelings that had been building since the moment he pulled her from the stagecoach wreckage. The 2 days before her departure passed in a whirlwind of preparation and barely concealed emotion. Tucker insisted on providing her with supplies to replace what she'd lost, clothes ordered from a catalog months ago for a sister who decided to remain in Tennessee, a few books from his precious collection, and a small revolver for protection, though I aim to make sure you never need it. On her last night at the cabin, they sat outside beneath the stars, hands intertwined. 15 miles isn't so far, Elizabeth reminded him, echoing her words from weeks earlier. No, it isn't, Tucker agreed. I reckon I'll be making that ride often enough to wear a path in the dirt. Mrs. Hollister mentioned the school has living quarters attached for the teacher, Elizabeth said carefully. They're small but private. Tucker's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. Is that so? It is. And the position comes with a modest salary, enough to support a simple life. She turned to face him fully. Perhaps even enough to support two if one of them continued to run cattle on his homestead nearby. Tucker's expression grew serious. Elizabeth, are you proposing to me now? She laughed, the sound bright in the desert night. I suppose I am. We seem to have a habit of doing things backward, you and I. Tucker pulled her gently into his arms. I wouldn't have it any other way. But if we're doing this, we're doing it proper. I may be a simple cowboy, but I know enough to get down on one knee when asking a lady to be my wife. And there, under the vast canopy of stars, Tucker Morgan knelt before Elizabeth Stewart and asked her to marry him with words far more eloquent than she'd expected from a man who claimed no skill with language. She said yes, of course. How could she not, when fate had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances? The delegation from Redemption Creek arrived the next morning as promised. If they were surprised by the news of the engagement, they hid it well. Mrs. Hollister, in particular, seemed smugly satisfied, as if she'd predicted this outcome all along. The Reverend comes through town every third Sunday, she informed them. I'll make sure he knows to expect a wedding when he arrives next month. Elizabeth made the journey to Redemption Creek that day, her heart both full and divided. Leaving Tucker's cabin felt like leaving a piece of herself behind, but she knew it was only a temporary separation. True to his word, Tucker appeared in town 3 days later, ostensibly to trade but really to see Elizabeth. He cut a striking figure as he rode down the main street, drawing curious glances from the townspeople not yet accustomed to seeing their new schoolteacher blush at the sight of the solitary rancher. Over the following weeks, as Elizabeth prepared the schoolhouse and her leg continued to heal, Tucker became a regular visitor to Redemption Creek. He helped repair the schoolhouse roof, built new benches for the students, and won over even the most skeptical townspeople with his quiet integrity. When the Reverend arrived, the entire town turned out for the wedding. Elizabeth wore a simple cream dress ordered from a catalog, with wildflowers in her hair. Tucker had splurged on a new shirt and had actually trimmed his beard for the occasion. They exchanged vows beneath the shade of cottonwood trees behind the schoolhouse, their joined hands steady and sure. That night, as husband and wife, they stayed in the small living quarters that would be their home during the school term. In the summers and on holidays, they would return to Tucker's cabin, their cabin now where the desert stretched endless and beautiful around them. Did you ever imagine, Tucker asked as they lay together in the darkness, when you boarded that stagecoach, that this is where the journey would lead? Elizabeth nestled closer to him, breathing in the scent that had come to mean safety and love to her. Never. But then the best journeys are the ones that surprise us, aren't they? They surely are, Tucker agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. They surely are. 5 years later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Tucker taught their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony. Their daughter, just beginning to toddle, clutched at Elizabeth's skirts with tiny fists. The stagecoach route now passed much closer to their property, a testament to the growth of Redemption Creek and the surrounding area. Elizabeth still taught at the school, though she had an assistant now to help with the increasing number of students. Tucker's cattle operation had grown, providing a comfortable living for their family. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Elizabeth would think back to that terrible day when the stagecoach had crashed. The memory no longer brought fear or pain, only a profound gratitude. From the wreckage of disaster had come the greatest blessing of her life, a love that had grown stronger with each passing season. Rooted deep in the harsh but beautiful land they both now called home,